Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked dead center at John Kennedy and called him a joke, a walking punchline, a late-night comedian armed with nothing but a gavel. She delivered this assessment on live television, broadcasting her disdain into every high-definition camera positioned in the suffocatingly tense committee room, executing her strike before the senator had even spoken a single word in defense. What she did not know, and what the millions watching at home could not possibly fathom, was exactly what lay meticulously folded inside his breast pocket. 3 pristine index cards carrying her own exact words, held by the quiet, methodical man from Zachary, Louisiana, who had spent the entirety of his political career waiting for someone possessing exactly this brand of unearned confidence to stroll willingly into his crosshairs. By the time this relentless morning concluded, the Congresswoman who had built a formidable brand on unshakable verbal dominance would find herself entirely unable to finish a single sentence. This is precisely how the surgical dismantling of a political titan unfolded on the national stage. Senator Kennedy has spent nearly a decade in this body, Ocasio-Cortez declared, her voice ringing with the practiced cadence of a seasoned operative. He has produced one-liners. He has produced sound bites. He has produced the exact kind of quote that plays exceptionally well on the kind of television that people consume when they are fundamentally not paying attention. She executed a sharp theatrical turn toward the far end of the sprawling mahogany dais, locking eyes with her target. What we have down there is a very talented comedian with a gavel. Kennedy did not look up, nor did he flinch, offer a wry smile, or acknowledge the searing insult that had just been hurled across the chamber. Instead, in a display of glacial indifference, he casually picked up his pen, scratched a solitary note onto his yellow legal pad, set the pen back down with deliberate care, and returned his attention to whatever mundane document he had been reading prior to the interruption. The packed gallery, brimming with journalists, operatives, and citizens, watched him execute this sequence of mundane actions, holding their collective breath as they waited for a fiery reaction that simply never materialized. Sitting quietly in the third row of that breathless gallery was a man named Raymond Thibodeau, a 68-year-old retired pipe fitter hailing from Sulphur, Louisiana, who had driven 4.5 grueling hours through the early morning darkness just to be in this room. Raymond stared at Kennedy with the piercing, intense scrutiny of a man who desperately needs to confirm if the person representing him had just heard the exact same disrespect he had witnessed. Kennedy remained entirely focused on the yellow legal pad, but he had heard every single syllable, and the solitary note he had just written on that pad was about to dictate the trajectory of the entire hearing. So, burn the image of that yellow legal pad into your memory, because its significance will become undeniably paramount before the gavel falls this morning. If you have ever been forced to sit quietly and watch someone decide before a single substantive word was even spoken that your entire part of the country was fundamentally unserious and unworthy of respect, you need to stay locked in with me right now. The man she just dismissed as a walking punchline is about to be handed the microphone, and the very first tactical maneuver he executes will vividly illustrate everything you need to know about the absolute devastation that follows. The committee chairman, maintaining the austere decorum of the chamber, methodically worked his way through the opening procedural business before finally nodding toward the far end of the elevated dais, yielding the floor. Senator Kennedy. Kennedy slowly looked up from his papers, deliberately setting his pen down on the wood. He reached out with 2 fingers, dragging the gooseneck microphone a mere half-inch closer to his mouth, and offered Ocasio-Cortez the quintessential, slow Louisiana smile, the specific kind of smile that suggests a man has just remembered a mildly amusing anecdote from 3 days prior and is internally debating whether the punchline is actually worth sharing with the room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, he drawled, his tone utterly devoid of malice. He shifted his gaze directly to Ocasio-Cortez. Congresswoman, I sincerely appreciate you being here. I know it is a considerable drive down from New York, she responded with crisp, guarded professionalism. Happy to be here, she countered. Good, good, Kennedy nodded, the rhythm of his speech dripping with a disarming Southern molasses. Now, I read your testimony. I read the whole thing, which I want you to know is not something I invariably do, so please take that as a genuine compliment. A small, polite ripple of laughter cascaded through the gallery, friendly and unassuming, completely ignorant of the trap being laid. And I want to start with something highly specific. You testified unequivocally that working families across this country are being aggressively priced out of housing because of what you explicitly called the predatory concentration of rental units in private equity portfolios. That is your exact phrase, is it not? She nodded, her posture rigid. That is correct. Kennedy leaned in just a fraction. All right. Now you represent New York's 14th congressional district, comprising roughly 150,000 households, approximately. Yes, she confirmed. And your proposed legislation outlines a federal subsidy structure that would, over the course of 10 years, redirect something in the staggering neighborhood of $40 billion toward affordable housing construction on a nationwide scale. Kennedy locked eyes with her, his expression unreadable. That is a massive number. I just want to make absolutely certain that I fully comprehend it. She immediately attempted to pivot to the abstract, the underlying analysis. I will happily get to the analysis, Kennedy interrupted, his voice as smooth and effortless as glass. I just want to ensure we are in total agreement on the baseline figures first. $40 billion allocated over a 10-year window. That is the official projection, correct? Yes. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, maintaining that same unhurried, infuriatingly patient expression, the look of a man politely asking for directions to a destination he already intimately knows, purely to test which direction you will point him. All right, now here is my central question. Of those $40 billion, exactly how much is statistically slated to go directly to the congressional districts of the members who actively voted to fund this initiative? And exactly how much is destined for the districts of the Americans who are going to be left holding the bill? The resulting pause was not particularly long in duration, but it possessed a dense, suffocating physical shape within the room. The allocation formula embedded within the legislation is strictly needs-based, Ocasio-Cortez responded, her tone tightening. It is meticulously indexed to the housing cost burden measured by county. It is fundamentally not a political map. Kennedy absorbed the defense without blinking. I completely understand that is what the mathematical formula claims on paper, he replied smoothly. I want to know what the formula actually executes in reality. Because the last three major federal housing initiatives, I took the liberty of looking them up, and I wrote the precise figures down right here, funneled somewhere between 62 and 71% of their total construction capital directly into the 20 largest metropolitan areas, which, quite coincidentally, happen to be represented almost entirely by the very members of Congress who authored the legislation. He let that devastating statistical reality hang suspended in the silent air of the chamber. Now, I am not accusing you of engineering that outcome on purpose. I am simply observing that it constitutes a definitive historical pattern, and I want to know with absolute certainty whether your bill disrupts that pattern or merely perpetuates it. Because the hardworking taxpayers in my state who are financing this massive endeavor deserve to know if they are essentially purchasing a house that they will never actually be legally permitted to live in. The atmosphere in the gallery abruptly shifted. The silence was no longer the relaxed quiet of an audience waiting for a comedian's punchline, but rather the stark, terrifying silence of a room that has just realized the comedian had walked in armed with a hyper-accurate calculator. Ocasio-Cortez leaned aggressively into her microphone, her defensive instincts flaring. Senator, the allocation formula was specifically and painstakingly designed to directly address historical systemic inequities in federal housing investment, including. Kennedy cut through her rhetoric with surgical precision. I am fully aware of what the formula was designed to do, he stated flatly. I want to know what it mathematically does. Do you currently possess the county-level distribution projections for the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama? She broke eye contact, hurriedly flipping a page in her thick briefing folder, then another, the rustle of paper echoing loudly in the tense room. I have the regional summary available, she offered defensively. The regional summary neatly places Louisiana into the South Atlantic geographic region. Kennedy countered without missing a beat, exposing the bureaucratic obfuscation, which is a remarkably broad category that also conveniently encompasses Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. So, when I review the South Atlantic regional allocation, I essentially cannot tell how much of that taxpayer money is actually making its way down to Baton Rouge, and how much is being quietly absorbed by Bethesda. He picked up his cold cup of coffee, took a momentary sip, found it entirely unsatisfying, and placed it back onto the dais with a muted thud. I am going to explicitly instruct my legislative staff to send your office a formal request for the specific figures I am looking for. I would highly prefer to have those exact answers in hand before we are asked to cast a vote. He looked at her, his demeanor impossibly level and devoid of any performative outrage. That is absolutely not a hostile request, Congresswoman. That is simply what rigorous congressional oversight looks like when somebody is actually doing the hard work. And here is the fundamental truth you desperately need to understand about the political lethality of John Kennedy. The specific trait that the veteran operatives who had watched him operate in these high-stakes rooms knew intimately to watch out for. He never, ever showed you his final destination, and he never telegraphed his punches. Those initial 6 questions were never actually about the intricacies of housing policy. They were a tactical mechanism designed to establish in front of the flashing cameras in the silent gallery that he had read her legislation significantly closer than she had ever anticipated, that he possessed raw numerical data that she did not have readily available in front of her, and that the very man she had publicly branded a lazy comedian had done a level of exhaustive homework that the comedian was fundamentally not supposed to be capable of executing. The political ground beneath her feet had shifted just slightly, but just enough to alter the gravity of the room. I have got a few more questions, Kennedy announced seamlessly, and they are going to pivot to an entirely different subject. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and extracted the 3 folded index cards, laying them face down on the polished wood of the dais, intentionally not touching them yet. You traveled to Munich this past February, Kennedy stated. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw set noticeably, her defensive posture hardening. It was a massive stage, addressing a truly global audience. You traveled there specifically to make the compelling case that the Democratic Party is fully prepared to lead on matters of complex foreign policy. That is a profoundly serious undertaking, and I want to offer you my full, unvarnished credit for possessing that level of ambition. She stared back, unyielding. I stand emphatically behind every single word I said there. Kennedy tilted his head, adopting a remarkably mild, curious expression, the look of an amateur geologist who keeps discovering the exact same fascinating rock in entirely different rivers. I am well aware that you do, and that is precisely why I want to ask you about something highly specific. When you were passionately discussing the geopolitical situation in Venezuela, specifically regarding the current administration's diplomatic actions toward the Maduro government, you stated on the record, and I am going strictly to quote your exact words here, that doesn't mean that we can systematically kidnap a foreign head of state and actively engage in acts of war simply because the nation happens to be located below the equator. He locked his piercing gaze onto her. Where exactly is Venezuela located, ma'am, relative to the equator? The ensuing beat of silence was agonizing. I was attempting to articulate a much broader geopolitical argument regarding, she began, scrambling for rhetorical cover. I completely understand the nature of the argument, and I promise I will get to the substance of it, Kennedy interjected smoothly. I just want to establish the basic geography first, purely so we are all confidently standing on the exact same map. Kennedy looked at her with an expression of weaponized patience, the kind of look that masterfully masquerades as Southern kindness until you suddenly realize there is absolutely nowhere soft embedded within it. Is the sovereign nation of Venezuela located above the equator or is it located below it? The entire committee room plunged into a suffocating, heavy, quiet, the specific brand of silence that descends when every single person in the room already knows the devastating answer and is morbidly watching to see if the star witness does. I genuinely misspoke during my time in Munich, Ocasio-Cortez finally admitted, her voice tight. The substantive core of the argument. You absolutely did misspeak, Kennedy agreed, his voice dropping any pretense of warmth. Venezuela is located entirely north of the equator. The capital city of Caracas sits at approximately 10 degrees north latitude. That is fundamentally not a borderline questionable call. That is a geographic discrepancy of a couple thousand miles. Not a borderline call. He paused, letting the crushing reality of the error saturate the room. I specifically took the time to look it up this morning just to make absolutely certain that I was not the one suffering from geographical confusion. That final sentence was delivered completely flat, entirely devoid of a smile or a smirk. The gallery instantly broke. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a raw, visceral, involuntary eruption of genuine laughter, the kind that violently escapes from people's throats before their brains can process whether they actually intended to laugh. A stoic man seated near the center aisle aggressively pressed his fist against his mouth to stifle the sound. A veteran reporter's shoulders heaved visibly as she tried to maintain professional composure. The wave of laughter rolled outward from the epicenter of the chamber and took a grueling 4 seconds to finally settle down. Down in the third row, Raymond Thibodeau simply shook his head slowly from side to side. He wasn't laughing. He was shaking his head with the grim validation of a man who suddenly realizes that a long-held, deeply cynical suspicion about the ruling class had just been unequivocally proven true on national television. Now, I am certainly not going to make a massive federal case out of a simple geography slip, Kennedy continued, raising one hand in a gesture of faux magnanimity. Lord knows I have personally uttered things on live camera that I would desperately love to take back. One time, I foolishly told a room packed full of wealthy donors that I had personally read every single word of a complex bill that hadn't even been physically printed yet. So I am absolutely not sitting up here acting as the geography police. He reached out and deliberately turned the very first index card face up on the desk. But here is the inescapable issue, Congresswoman. You confidently marched into this hearing room this morning and you looked into those cameras and explicitly told this committee and every single American watching at home that I fundamentally do not produce anything of serious consequence. You stated that I produce nothing but shallow punchlines and that this great country has officially run out of time for jokes. Kennedy stared at her, his gaze steady, the southern smile entirely eradicated from his features. And yet, in the exact same month that you flew to Munich to explicitly demonstrate to the entire world that you and your party are ready to command global foreign policy, you publicly placed a sovereign nation in the entirely wrong half of the God-given planet, standing on a world stage with the international cameras rolling. He let the devastating juxtaposition breathe in the stifling air. Now, I want to be eminently fair to you. One isolated slip does not constitute a definitive pattern. But it absolutely does make that aggressive opening statement of yours this morning remarkably interesting. If you have ever been arrogantly dismissed as the unserious one by somebody who couldn't successfully pass a 5th grade middle school geography quiz, I need you to leave one single word in the comments right now. Just one word. Type Munich, because what you have just witnessed is merely the prologue to the real story. Kennedy still possessed 2 untouched index cards in that stack, and the second one carried a significantly heavier payload than the first. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw tightened visibly. She was not a novice. She had survived hostile rooms before, rooms overflowing with people who desperately wanted her to fail before she even opened her mouth. She had constructed her entire formidable political brand by mastering the art of turning those hostile rooms to her advantage, and when she felt the ground crumbling beneath her, she executed her signature maneuver. She aggressively changed the fundamental parameters of the fight. She leaned into the microphone, and when her voice returned, it had successfully located its familiar electrifying current. Senator, I want to be exceptionally clear about what is actually transpiring in this room right now, she declared, her eyes bypassing Kennedy and locking directly onto the television cameras, the instinctive, brilliant reflex of a politician hunting for the viral clip. Because I firmly believe that the American people watching this exchange deserve absolute clarity. A woman of color comes to the United States Congress to testify under oath about a catastrophic housing crisis that is actively destroying working families across this entire country. She misstates a minor geographic coordinate in an entirely separate, unrelated venue weeks ago during a complex conversation about a fundamentally different geopolitical policy. And what is the immediate response from the other end of this dais? It is not a substantive question about the intricacies of housing. It is not a question about the millions of desperate Americans who literally cannot afford to keep a roof over their heads. It is a condescending geography quiz. Her voice had fully locked into its rhythmic, impassioned cadence now. I have been fiercely dedicated to this work for 6 arduous years. I have successfully passed sweeping legislation. I have relentlessly fought for marginalized people who could not possibly afford to hire a high-priced K Street lobbyist. And every single time, the calculated response from the other side of the aisle is not to genuinely engage with the substantive policy. It is to desperately hunt for one isolated moment, one misplaced sentence, one incorrect word, and violently weaponize it to erase everything else. She pointed an accusatory finger toward the packed gallery. The powerful, resilient women in this country know this exact playbook intimately. You sit back and wait for one human mistake, just one, and then you ruthlessly deploy it as if it constitutes a complete and total biography. As if reciting geography is an accurate stand-in for human intelligence, and intelligence is a stand-in for intrinsic worthiness, and worthiness is a divine attribute that men exactly like you get to unilaterally assign to the rest of us. This is fundamentally not about Venezuela. It was never actually about Venezuela. It is entirely about who gets the privilege of being taken seriously in these halls of power. And I absolutely will not sit at this table and pretend otherwise. And for a fleeting electric moment, you had to grant her the full measure of respect because the raw power of the delivery was undeniably real. The physical atmosphere of the room shifted noticeably. The rhythmic cadence of her speech was genuine. The fiery anger was seemingly not a manufactured performance. A veteran reporter in the front row was scribbling frantically, his pen tearing across the notepad. A young female staffer in the gallery, who had been struggling to suppress a mocking grin during the brutal geography exchange, now looked down at her own hands, an undeniable shift of empathy washing over her features. The old, deeply ingrained Washington reflex rippled through the chamber, the highly trained institutional instinct to immediately step back and cower from the sheer size and moral weight of that specific accusation, rather than daring to clinically examine the actual facts buried underneath it. That powerful spell held the room hostage for 20 seconds. Raymond Thibodeau, immovable in the third row, shifted his gaze away from the Congresswoman and looked directly at Senator Kennedy. Kennedy was, once again, calmly writing on his yellow legal pad. He did not look up to absorb the rhetorical blows. He scratched out a few words, deliberately drew a slow, definitive line underneath them, and set the pen down. He waited patiently for the electric current of her speech to completely dissipate through the room. Then, without an ounce of hesitation, he reached forward and flipped the second index card face up. "I sincerely appreciate that perspective, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice completely unaltered, maintaining the exact same unhurried drawl, the same flat, impenetrable patience of an old man sitting quietly on a front porch all afternoon who was in absolutely no particular hurry to retreat inside. And I give you my word, I want to come back to the critical issue of housing in just a minute. I explicitly promised the chairman that I would get there. He tapped the second index card. But since we are boldly committed to being entirely honest about what transpired in Munich, I want to ask you about the other monumental question they posed to you that evening. Because the geography error, I will readily grant you, is a simple human slip. It genuinely happens to the absolute best of us. He leveled his gaze directly at her. The other answer, however, is significantly harder to categorize as a mere slip. He looked down at the meticulously transcribed text on the card. Somebody in that audience directly asked you whether the United States military should commit American troops to physically defend Taiwan in the event that China initiates a hostile takeover. That is, without exaggeration, the single most consequential and volatile question in American foreign policy right now. Every single strategic ally we possess and every single dangerous adversary we face is watching with bated breath to see exactly how American leaders choose to answer it. Kennedy looked back up, his face devoid of any performative sarcasm. I am going to read exactly what you said to the international community. This is not my partisan paraphrase. This is the official, verified transcript. He read the words with a chillingly flat delivery. I think that this is such a, I think that this is a, this is, of course, a very long-standing policy of the United States. He set the index card down onto the mahogany desk. 5 ums, 20 agonizing seconds of stalling. And then you finally concluded by stating that you simply hoped we would never have to find out. The room had instantly gone unnervingly still. It was not the amused, shocked stillness that followed the geography blunder. It was a profoundly heavier, darker stillness. Now, I deeply understand the natural political instinct to be incredibly careful with your words, Kennedy continued. I truly do. Being careful is a genuine, undeniable virtue in this perilous line of work, and I would infinitely rather have a careful leader at the helm than a reckless one any day of the week. But there is a massive, unforgiving difference between being careful and being entirely empty. And when the explicit question is whether we will shed blood to stand with a democratic ally, while every hostile foreign ministry on the face of the earth is diligently taking notes, being empty carries a catastrophic cost. It just doesn't happen to get paid by the powerful person safely standing at the microphone. Down in the cramped third row, Raymond Thibodeau had gone rigid, staring blankly ahead. He was suddenly consumed by the thought of his nephew, a young man who had served 2 grueling combat tours in the Pacific Theater, the exact kind of young American who would inevitably be one of the faceless people paying the ultimate cost that elite politicians so casually evade. I am going to ask you a very direct question right now, Kennedy stated, slicing through the heavy air. And I would deeply appreciate a highly direct answer, yes or no. We can happily dive into the complex nuance immediately after. He locked eyes with Ocasio-Cortez. Do you unequivocally believe that the United States should officially commit to the military defense of Taiwan? Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to speak. Yes or no, ma'am? If you have ever sat helplessly and watched with seething frustration as somebody cloistered in Washington blatantly refused to answer the one critical thing you most desperately needed answered, subscribe to this channel right now, because what Kennedy just executed is exactly what somebody should have aggressively done 2 years ago. And the specific manner in which she chooses to answer or refuses to answer, this definitive trap is going to illuminate absolutely everything about what that arrogant opening statement this morning was truly manufactured from. The nuance, Ocasio-Cortez fired back, her voice shaking with barely contained outrage, is the entire fundamental point of the diplomatic discussion. The nuance is precisely what separates a sophisticated geopolitical policy from a shallow, reductionist bumper sticker, and I absolutely will not casually reduce the sacred lives of American service members to a simplistic yes or no soundbite that gets maliciously clipped and weaponized by right-wing media before sundown. All right, Kennedy replied softly. All right. He calmly reached out and picked up the third and final index card. Let's pivot and talk about something a little closer to home then. The highly publicized Fighting Oligarchy tour this past spring. You and Senator Bernie Sanders. 34 massive rallies, 300,000 screaming supporters spanning across 20 different states. I am incredibly proud of that grassroots work, she snapped, defiant. You absolutely should be. Kennedy nodded, his tone carrying an almost genuine sense of admiration. That is an astonishing number of people. That is a grueling number of miles on the road. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I want to ask you specifically about the nature of those miles. He flipped the final card face up. Your official, legally mandated campaign finance reports reveal that in the year 2025, your political campaign spent an astounding $53,000 exclusively on 4-star and 5-star luxury hotel accommodations. The Langham Huntington in Pasadena, the Vidara in Las Vegas, the Asher Adams in Salt Lake City, the Lansdowne Resort out in Virginia. He stared at her, the Southern charm entirely evaporated. That staggering amount of money came directly from your small dollar working class donors. The $10 and $20 people who believe in your movement. He allowed a punishing pause to settle over the chamber. Now, I want to meticulously pair that financial data with one other crucial detail because I want the complete, unvarnished picture painted before I formally ask my question. During that exact same tour, investigative reporting revealed that you and Senator Sanders were exclusively flying on private chartered jets to attend those West Coast rallies. Ocasio-Cortez aggressively opened her mouth to interrupt, the panic finally breaching her composure. Kennedy simply raised one hand, patient, immovable. In the exact same week that you flew on a private luxury jet into Los Angeles, you stood on a brightly lit stage and passionately told a roaring crowd of working Americans that the billionaire class had completely rigged the economic system against ordinary people, and that ordinary people desperately needed to rise up and fight back. He slowly set the final card down on the wood. I want to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I am asking this with absolute sincerity. Kennedy looked directly at her, deploying that steady, unhurried, devastating look, the terrifyingly serene look of a man who requires absolutely nothing from the person sitting across the table. When you passionately instruct working-class people to go out and fight a rigged system, which 5-star luxury hotel are you quietly retreating to after the cameras turn off? The sprawling gallery went deathly quiet, a guttural silence of a room recognizing an undeniable truth. Because here is exactly what I have observed, Congresswoman, Kennedy continued, his voice growing quieter, more surgical. There are certain politicians in this country who casually put on the working class the exact same way you put on a winter coat. When the bright television cameras click on, the working class coat goes on, but the absolute second those cameras go dark, they are safely back sipping room service at the Langham. He shook his head slowly. The people who are actually out there breaking their backs working, the desperate people who faithfully sent you their last $10, they notice. They always notice the hypocrisy. They just can't afford to buy a microphone to loudly say so. In the third row, Raymond Thibodeau looked down at his deeply lined hands, thinking about the unbridgeable distance between the $10 donors and the opulent luxury of the Langham. His jaw shifted once. A hard, grinding motion, forced to swallow the sheer weight of a truth finally spoken aloud. If you have ever personally known a politician who aggressively preached about systemic sacrifice from the fortified safety of a life they would violently refuse to ever give up, drop one word in the comments right now. Type Langham. Because what you have just heard is not a mere slip of the tongue, it is an undeniable structural pattern of deceit. And tonight is the very first night somebody forced Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to stand perfectly still inside of it. Pushed to the absolute brink, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reached for the one genuine weapon she had left, unleashing a blistering, impassioned defense of her working-class roots behind a bar to violently indict Senator John Kennedy's elite Oxford pedigree and accuse him of merely auditing the financial struggles she had physically survived. The exhausted room momentarily swayed with the undeniable heat of her delivery, but Kennedy simply waited with terrifying patience for the emotional shockwave to completely dissipate before slowly looking down at the single solitary word he had underlined on his yellow legal pad hours earlier. Stripped of his manufactured folksy warmth, he coldly acknowledged her early hardships, but brutally pinned her against her own arrogant opening statement, methodically reciting her recent catastrophic geopolitical blunders on the world stage, misplacing Venezuela, freezing on Taiwan, and ultimately blaming the American public for her own incompetence before delivering the ultimate coup de grace with a flat, emotionless Louisiana drawl. My daddy used to say that some people just got a billy goat brain and a mockingbird mouth. All the deafening noise in the world and not a single bite of actual feed. The gallery instantly shattered into a raw, explosive detonation of involuntary shock and hilarity, quickly followed by the most lethal, suffocating silence in Washington as every high-definition camera violently swiveled to capture a previously invincible political force, frantically scanning her empty notes, completely out of words, whispering her surrender, and quietly folding her hands in total defeat. As Kennedy calmly crossed out the solitary word on his pad, having entirely dismantled her with just one of his 3 prepared index cards, a working-class man named Raymond Thibodeau began his long drive back to Louisiana, laughing alone in his truck at the sheer unhurried brilliance of the execution. But the true devastation was only just beginning. Slipping quietly past the frantic press pool, Kennedy produced a hidden 4th index card dense with the names and illicit monetary figures of the housing bill's true beneficiaries, pulling out his cell phone to dial a direct line to the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Division with a faint, chilling smile that promised the real hunt had finally commenced.